Some debts don't come with a number. They just sit there at the bottom of the page in the dark waiting. I kept books my whole life, not the kind bankers keep. Mine were smaller and meaner, who I owed, who owed me, and the one line I could never cross out because I never knew the name that belonged to it. For 22 years that line stayed open. One life owed to whom unknown. Then one autumn a woman came looking for me across 300 miles of hard country, carrying a letter she'd been writing, on and off, for most of her life. She was gone before she reached my gate, gone before her boy could get here, gone before I understood that the account I'd been trying to close all those years wasn't mine to settle at all. What was in that letter didn't just change a man's life. It gave a dead woman back her voice, gave a lost child back his name, and handed an old fool a truth he'd have paid anything not to hear, and then would have paid anything to keep. She was gone before he arrived, but her letter held a life-changing secret. The dog found her before I did. That's the part I keep circling back to even now. Old Pilot wasn't a hunting dog and never pretended to be one. He was a fence-post dog, a porch dog, the kind that barks at weather and sleeps through thieves. So when he came off the porch at a dead run that gray morning, throat working out a sound I'd never once heard him make, not a warning, something lower, something that sounded almost like grief, I knew before my boots hit the yard that the day had already turned into something I wouldn't get to choose. I followed him past the corral, past the dry wash where the cottonwoods stood stripped and rattling, out toward the north line where my land gave up and the government's began. The frost hadn't burned off yet. Every blade of grass wore a white edge, and my breath went out in front of me in ragged little clouds, and I remember thinking of all the useless things a mind grabs for at a moment like that. I remember thinking I'd have to oil the gate hinge before winter set in proper. Then I came over the rise and saw her, and I stopped thinking about hinges. She was lying at the foot of the fence, curled the way a person curls when the cold has crept all the way into the middle of them and they've stopped fighting it. An old woman. Apache, I saw that right off, the way she was dressed, the way she'd wrapped herself, the pattern of the blanket that was too thin by half for the night she'd spent under it. One arm was flung out across the frozen ground, fingers open, reaching toward my fence line like the wire itself was something she'd been trying to hold on to. I got down beside her. My knees don't do that well anymore, and they did it fast anyway. She was still alive, barely. There was a warmth in her that the ground hadn't taken yet, and when I got my hand under her head, her eyes came open, dark, clouded at the edges, but they found me. They found my face and held it, and I watched something move behind them that I've spent a long time since trying to name. It wasn't fear. I've seen plenty of fear, and it wasn't that. It was closer to recognition. Like she'd walked a long way to see a particular thing, and here at the end of it, that thing was finally in front of her. "Easy now," I said, stupid words, the only ones I had. "Easy, I've got you, you're on Crane land now, you hear me? Nobody's going to trouble you here." Her lips moved. No sound came at first. Then on the second try, a single word, dry as the grass. "Sonny." I didn't understand. I thought it was pain talking, or delirium. Is that your name, Sonny?" The smallest movement of her chin, yes. "All right, Sonny, I'm Crane, Eli Crane. I'm going to get you inside and warm, and then..." Her hand came off the frozen ground and took my wrist. I've been gripped hard by strong men, and I'll tell you her grip was stronger than it had any right to be, coming out of a body that light. She pulled at me urgent, and her eyes went from my face to a bundle beside her, an oilcloth satchel, the kind you'd carry a Bible in, dark with damp, and back to my face and back to the satchel. "Take it," she said, clear that time, clearer than a dying woman ought to be able to make herself. "The letter, you Crane, you give it to him." "To who, Sonny, to who?" "When he comes." Her breath was coming in shorter pulls now, the space between them widening. "He will come, I sent word, he will come here, you tell him." And then whatever she'd been saving her strength for, she'd spent it. Her hand loosened on my wrist. Her eyes stayed open, still fixed on me, but the light that had been steering them from behind stepped back, and then it was gone, and I was holding the head of a woman I had never in my life met before that morning, out at the cold edge of my property in the first white light of an autumn day. Pilot lay down in the frost beside her, and put his chin on his paws and didn't bark again. I'm going to tell you something about myself now, because you won't understand the rest of it otherwise, and I've decided a lot of things about telling this straight, that I'm not going to hide the parts that don't flatter me. I keep a book. Not a diary. I'd sooner eat the pages than write down my feelings. It's a ledger. A tall, thin, leather-bound thing, the spine gone soft as an old glove from 40 years of handling, and in it I keep accounts. But not money or not only money. I keep track of what's owed. It started when I was young and poor and had been cheated a few times too many, and I got it into my head that a man who wrote things down couldn't be lied to about them later. Rixai the freighter owed me 2 days' labor. I owed the widow Alcott for a winter's worth of stove wood. Charlie Redfern owed me a horse and paid it back in a mule, and I marked it settled anyway because a debt paid crooked is still a debt paid, and a man's got to be reasonable. Somewhere along the years it stopped being about money at all. It became, I don't know how to say it right, it became the way I held the world level. If a thing happened to me, good or bad, I wrote it down where it belonged, and once it was written, once it was accounted for, I could set it down and sleep. Kindness is owed. Cruelty's owed. My own mostly, if I'm honest, and I've just told you I'm going to be. There was one line in that book I never could settle. I'll come to it, don't rush me. I've been rushing at it in my head for 2 decades, and it doesn't come any easier for the running start. I carried Sani inside. She weighed less than a saddle. I laid her out on the long table in the front room, and I built the fire up, though there was no use in it now, and I sat with her because it seemed wrong to leave her alone so soon after she died alone. And while I sat, I did what I always do when I don't know what to do with myself. I opened my book, I found a clean line, and I wrote it down because that's how I make a thing real. Woman, Apache, name Sani. Came a long way to find someone, died on my north line before she could. Owed her. Shelter she didn't live to take, and the delivering of one letter to a person unknown when he comes. I sat looking at that a long time. When he comes, she'd said it like a certainty. She'd sent word, she said, to a him. And she'd crossed however many 100 miles of country an old woman shouldn't be crossing alone in the cold with nothing but a thin blanket and an oilcloth satchel to be here when he arrived, and she'd missed it by a night. Maybe by hours. That's the kind of arithmetic the world runs on, and it's the cruelest arithmetic there is. You spend your whole life getting somewhere, and then you fall short of the gate by the length of one bad night. The satchel was on the table beside her. I hadn't opened it. I want that on the record, whoever's keeping one, I didn't open it. It wasn't mine to open. She'd said give it to him, not read it and see what's what, and there's a difference, and I've built my whole life on differences like that one. But I looked at it. God help me, I looked at it a long while. The nearest thing I've got to a neighbor is a mescalero man named Diego who runs a few horses on the flat below the mesa. His people and mine haven't always been easy. That's a soft way of putting a hard history, and I'll get to the hardness. But Diego and I have an understanding worn smooth by years. The kind 2 old men come to when they've both buried enough to know that grudges are just one more thing that outlives its usefulness. I rode down to him that afternoon because a body has to be seen to, and because I needed to speak Sani's name to someone who might know what it meant. He was mending a fence when I got there. He didn't stop right away. He's like me that way, a man who'll finish the wire he's on before he'll turn to bad news, because bad news will keep and the wire won't. When he did turn, he read my face and set down his tools. I told him, all of it in the order it had come, the dog, the frost, the grip on my wrist, the words she'd made herself say. Sani, the letter, give it to him when he comes. Diego was quiet for a long time. He's a quiet man to begin with, but this was a different quiet. He looked off north, toward my land, toward the country beyond it, and something worked in his jaw. Sani, he said finally, not to me, to the name, like he was testing whether it was really the one I'd said. You know it. I know a Sani. He picked a splinter of fence wood off his sleeve and turned it in his fingers. Or I knew of one long time back, Chiricahua, not Mescalero. There was a... He stopped, started again, choosing the road carefully. There was a bad winter, Eli. You'd have been young, I'd have been younger. A camp got hit up along the Bonito. Soldiers and some others riding with them, settler men, angry about stock they'd lost or said they'd lost. They burned it out, killed most. The ones that lived scattered, went south, went to the reservation, went nowhere. He looked at me. There was a woman named Sani who lived through that. Story was she lost her whole family in it and kept living anyway, which some people can't forgive a person for, though I never understood the arithmetic of that either. The Banir. I want to tell you the ground didn't move under me when he said that word. I want to tell you I sat my horse easy and nodded like a man hearing about strangers. The Bonito, up along the Bonito. I was there. Now I've said it, and I'll have to say the rest, and there's no way to make it come out clean, so I'll just let it come out true. I was 26 years old the winter the camp on the Bonito burned. I wasn't a soldier. I want that understood, though I've long since stopped believing it makes a difference. I was a young rancher who'd lost stock, some horses run off, and I'd convinced myself, the way a young hot man will, that they'd been taken and not simply strayed. A man came through raising a party to ride up and settle it. I was angry and I was young and I had opinions about people I'd never troubled to actually know, and I got on my horse and I rode with them. I've spent the years since trying to make myself into a bystander in my own memory. It doesn't work. I was there. I rode up a frozen creek with a rifle in a scabbard and a righteousness in my chest. And the camp we found wasn't a war camp, it was families. And by the time I understood it all the way down, the thing was already happening and I was already part of the thing, whether I fired or not, whether I looked away or not. I didn't kill anyone. I've told myself that 10,000 times and it's even true, and it's the smallest, poorest true thing a man ever hid behind. I froze. I sat my horse at the edge of it and I froze, and the world tore itself apart in front of me, and when it was over I was still a man who'd ridden up that creek on purpose. But here's the part that made the line in my book. Here's the debt I could never settle. When it was ending, when the shooting had mostly stopped and the smoke was lying flat and black over the snow, I heard a sound I couldn't account for. A thin sound. Under a collapsed brush shelter at the edge of the camp, half buried, mostly hidden, I found a child, an infant. Wrapped tight and tucked deep into the wreckage by hands that had known exactly what they were doing, hidden the way you hide the most precious thing you own from men who have come to take everything, and those hands hadn't come back for it, because those hands couldn't. I understood that even then. Whoever had hidden this child hadn't survived to unhide it. I could have left it, some of the men would have. I've never been sure, in the worst part of the night, whether leaving it would have been more honest than what I did. What I did was, I took it. I got down and I dug that baby out of the frozen brush, and I put it inside my own coat against my own chest, and I turned my horse and I rode away from that place, and I never told a living soul I'd been there. And a week later, 100 miles gone, I handed that child to a missionary couple headed east, good people, or people I chose to believe were good, because it made it easier to hand a living child to strangers, and I told them I'd found it orphaned on the trail. Which was, in the cruelest possible reading, not even a lie. I never learned if it was a boy or a girl. I didn't let myself look close enough to know. I told myself that was mercy, that a clean break was kinder. But the truth, the whole truth I've only lately been able to hold, is that I didn't want to know, because knowing would have made the child someone, and I could not carry someone. I could barely carry the memory of the sound it made. That's the line in my ledger. I wrote it that night, camped alone and shaking, in a hand I could hardly read the next morning. One life taken out of the fire, given away, owed to whom, unknown, cannot be paid. 22 years, that line sat open. I'd closed the book on it every night, and every night it stayed open anyway, the way a wound closed over a splinter stays a wound. And now an old Chiricahua woman named Sani, a woman who lived through the Bonito, had crossed 300 miles to die on my fence line, holding a letter for him who was coming. You do the arithmetic. I did. I sat there on my horse in front of Diego's half-mended fence, and I did the arithmetic, and I felt every year of my life stand up at once. Eli, Diego was watching me. He'd watched the whole thing cross my face, I think. I've never been a hard man to read, only a hard one to like. Where'd you go just now? Back, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. I went back a ways. He didn't push. That's the mercy of an old man for an old man. He said we'd see to the burying, that his wife's people would know the right of it better than I would, that a Chiricahua woman ought to be laid down by someone who knew the words, and I was grateful past speaking, because I'd been dreading the thought of putting her in the ground like a stranger when she'd clearly died being anything but. I rode home in the dark. The letter was still in the satchel on my table. Sani was still on my table beside it. And somewhere out in the wide, dark country, riding toward my gate through country he maybe didn't know, was a hymn. A man Sani had sent for. A man who was going to arrive too late to hear her voice, and who was going to find, waiting for him, an old rancher with a soft-spined book full of debts, and one line in it that had just, in the space of an afternoon, grown a face. I didn't sleep. I sat up with her and the fire and the book. Near midnight, I did a thing I'm not proud of and won't pretend I didn't. I took the satchel in my lap. I didn't open the letter, I keep telling you, and it stays true. I didn't open it, but I felt the shape of what was inside through the oilcloth, the way you'll feel a wrapped gift to guess it, and there were papers, a thick fold of them, more than one letter's worth, years of writing by the heft of it. And there was something else, something small and hard sewn into a pocket of the cloth itself. A stone, I thought, or a bead. I put it down. I made myself put it down. Some doors you don't open just to see the room. You wait to be let in, or you stand outside them the rest of your life, and either way you keep your hands to yourself. Toward dawn, Pilot lifted his head off the floor and looked at the door and made that low sound again, the grief sound, the one I'd never heard before yesterday and now dreaded. There was a horse coming up my road in the gray, slow, tired. A rider who'd come a long way, and from the sag of him, even at that distance, sensed already that the end of the road wasn't going to hold what he'd been riding toward. I stood up. My knees did their slow argument. I set the ledger on the table, open to the line with the face, and I went to the door to meet whatever was coming, and I remember thinking, the last clear thought I had before everything I understood about my own life came apart and got put back together wrong, I remember thinking. She was gone before he arrived, but her letter held a life-changing secret. He sat his horse like a man who'd forgotten it was under him. That was the first thing I marked about him, standing there in my doorway with the gray dawn coming up cold behind him, that he'd stopped his animal in the middle of my yard and just sat, reins loose in his hands, staring at my house the way you'd stare at a word you couldn't quite read. Not looking for anybody, not calling out. Just looking like the house might tell him something if he waited long enough, and dreading whatever it was going to say. A young man, somewhere past 20 and not by much, tall though the road had folded him down some. He wore town clothes worn hard by country, a good wool coat gone shabby at the cuffs, boots that had been made for walking on boards and had done a lot of walking on stone instead. His hat was Eastern, his face was not. I'd told myself in the long hours of that night that I would not do the thing I was about to do. I'd told myself it was a fool's errand and worse than a fool's, a cruelty to myself and maybe to him. And then he lifted his eyes from the house to me standing in the door, and I did it anyway. I couldn't not. I looked at the shape of that young man's face in the dawn light, and I searched it, feature by feature, for a baby I'd carried inside my coat for 100 miles 22 years gone, and had never once let myself look at square. I don't know what I expected, that a face keeps its infancy written on it somewhere if you know to look. It doesn't. There's nothing of the baby left in the man. I searched him and found a stranger, and the finding was its own small grief, one more I hadn't budgeted for. "You be Crane," he said, not a question. His voice was low and careful and had the East in it, schooled out of whatever it started as. "Eli Crane." I would be. My mouth was dry as the grass she died on. "You've come a long way, son." Something flinched across his face at the word son. I didn't understand it yet. I filed it, old habit. A bookkeeper marks the entries he can't yet total. "I've come looking for a woman," he said. "She wrote me to come here to this place, to your land. She said," he stopped, swallowed, started over with the flat determination of a man walking into cold water on purpose. "She said she'd meet me here, an old woman, Chiricahua. She goes by Sani. Do you," and now the careful voice cracked clean down the middle, just for a word, just for one, "do you know her? Is she here?" Pilot came off the porch and went to the young man's horse and sat down in front of it and looked up at the rider and did not bark. Dogs know. I'll go to my own grave believing dogs know things before we let ourselves. I have delivered bad news a handful of times in a long life. There's no good way, and I've quit looking for one. You can't set a thing like that down gentle. The weight of it is the weight of it no matter how careful your hands. So I did the only thing I've ever found that's worth doing. I told him the truth plainly, and I stood close enough to catch him if the truth put him down. "She's here," I said, "but she's gone, son. She came in the night 2 nights back on foot across my north line, and the cold had her before I found her yesterday morning. She lived a few minutes after, long enough to speak, not long enough for much." I made myself hold his eyes while I said the rest. "She was gone before you got here. I'm sorry. I'm as sorry as a stranger can be, which I know isn't worth much, but it's true, and I'll say it. I'm sorry. I have seen strong men take a bullet with less change in their faces than went across his." He didn't cry out. That's not always the worst grief. The worst grief a lot of the time is the quiet kind. The kind that goes inward and pulls the whole man down into itself like a well collapsing. He sat his horse and he looked at me, and his eyes went bright and then flat, bright and then flat, like a lamp somebody was turning up and down. and his hands closed on the reins hard enough that the horse tossed its head, and he said, very softly to himself more than to me, "We never met. Son, in our whole lives, not once." His voice was going somewhere strange and far. 2 years of letters, 2 years. And I rode as hard as a man can ride. I didn't stop but to water the horse. He looked at his own hands like they'd failed him personally. How many hours? Just tell me that much. How many hours did I miss it by? And that, God forgive me, is the cruelest arithmetic there is. And I told you back at the start, it's the arithmetic the whole world runs on. I didn't know the answer, and I wouldn't have given it if I did. Some sums you don't make a grieving man carry. Come down off that horse, I said instead. Come inside. She's laid out proper and warm, and you can sit with her, which is a thing you can still do, and it's more than a lot of us get. I put my hand up toward his bridle slow, the way you would with a spooked animal, because that's what he was right then, spooked all the way through. Come on. You didn't ride 300 miles to fall off your horse in my yard. Come down, come and see her. He came down. His legs nearly went 300 miles, and no sleep will do that. And I got a shoulder under his arm, and for a moment I held up the whole weight of him, this grown stranger, the same way I'd once held the whole weight of an infant against my chest and ridden away and never looked. My mind made that comparison all on its own, and I hated it for making it, and I couldn't stop it. That's the thing about the accounts a man keeps. Once a line's open, it reads itself into everything. I let him sit with her alone. I stood out on the porch in the cold with Pilot, and I let a young man I didn't know sit in my front room with a dead woman he'd never met. And through the door I could hear the low, broken sound of him talking to her, telling her things. I suppose, the way you do, all the things 2 years of letters hadn't held, all the things a first meeting was supposed to carry that now would never have anywhere to go. I didn't listen to the words. A man's owed that much privacy at least. But I heard the shape of it, the rise and fall, and it went on a long while, and Pilot leaned his weight against my leg the whole time, and the sun came up over the mesa without any regard for any of it, the way the sun does. When he came out, his face had changed. The first shattering was over. What was left was the thing that comes after, which is quieter and lasts longer and never fully leaves. I know it, I've worn it, the settled weight of a loss you're going to be carrying from here on. She wrote me a letter, he said. In the letters, the last one, months back, she said she'd been writing me a real one, a long one. She said she'd bring it. She said there were things she couldn't put down in the ones that went through the mail, things she'd only say to my face, or nearest to my face she could get. She said, he steadied himself on the porch post. She said it would tell me who I am. And there it was, laid on my porch boards in the morning cold. The reason a dying woman had crossed 300 miles of hard country. The letter I'd carried in my lap at midnight and hadn't opened, because it wasn't mine to open, because give it to him is not read it and see. She had a satchel, I said. My voice had gone unsteady and I didn't try to fix it. Oilcloth, it's inside. She made me promise, son, the last words she had in her near enough, she made me promise to give it to you. To him, she said. I didn't know who him was. Now I do. I opened my door. It's yours. It was always going to be yours. Come and take it. He held the satchel a long time before he opened it. We sat at my table, the same long table she'd been laid out on, though I'd moved her before he came out, laid her careful on the bed in the back room under a good blanket, because a man shouldn't have to read the truth of his life sitting across from the corpse that carried it, and some mercies you can arrange even when you can't arrange the ones that matter. I put coffee in front of him. He didn't drink it. His hands weren't ready to do 2 things at once. They had all they could handle just holding that oilcloth bundle and not opening it. The way you'll stand outside a door you've walked toward your whole life and find, at the very last, that your hand won't work the latch. You don't have to do it now, I said. It'll keep. She kept it 2 years. It'll keep an afternoon. No, he shook his head slow. No, I've been not knowing my whole life, mister. I've been not knowing so long it stopped being a thing that happened to me and started being just what I am. A man with a hole where the first part goes. He worked the tie loose. I'm not spending one more night on the not knowing side of this if the knowing side is sitting right here in my hands. He opened it. I made to get up and leave him to it. He put a hand on my arm, quick, almost panicked, and said, "Stay." Just that. "Stay, please. I don't think I can do this with nobody in the room." And I understood that, too. There are truths so heavy you need a witness just to survive the lifting of them, even a stranger, even an old fool you met an hour ago. Maybe especially. A stranger's got no stake in who you turn out to be. So I stayed. And I watched a young man read the letter that a dead woman had spent her last strength on this earth to carry to him. And though I didn't read it over his shoulder, I'm telling you again, and it stays true. He read parts of it aloud, in pieces, in a voice that broke and mended and broke. Because there are things a person can't take in silently. Things that have to be said out into the air by your own mouth before they'll fit inside you. And this is what was in it, not all of it. I'll never know all of it, and neither will you, and that's as it should be. But this is what came out into my front room that morning, in a dead woman's words and a living man's cracking voice. She began with his name. Not the name the missionaries gave him, Samuel Wells. That was theirs, a good plain Eastern name for a foundling of no known people. And he'd worn it his whole life the way you wear another man's coat, warm enough but never fitted. She began with the other name, the first one. The one his mother spoke over him in a Chiricahua winter before the world ended, that no living soul had said aloud in 22 years because every mouth that knew it had been stopped. I won't write it here. He said it aloud once, sounding it out slow like a word in a foreign tongue, which to him it was, and then he put his hand over his mouth and couldn't say it again, and I'm not going to put on this page a thing a man could barely bear to say about himself. It's his. Some entries in a ledger aren't for reading out. But I'll tell you the shape of what the letter held, because that's the secret the title promised you, and I don't cheat a promise. Sonny was his grandmother, his mother's mother. She had been in that camp on the Bonito the winter it burned, the winter I rode up a frozen creek with a rifle in my scabbard, and a righteousness in my chest that I have spent every year since trying and failing to scrub out of my own memory. She had been there. And when the party came, when we came, and I make myself right we though every coward bone in me wants to write they, Sonny's daughter, this young man's mother, had done the thing that mothers do, the thing that is the whole terrible glory of what we are. She had taken her infant son and she had hidden him. Wrapped him tight and tucked him deep into the wreckage of a brush shelter at the camp's edge. Hidden him the way you hide the one thing worth more than your own life. And then she had gone back. Do you understand? Back toward the fire and the men and the noise, to try to draw them away from where she'd hidden him. She didn't come back for the child. I had known that for 22 years. I'd known it the moment I dug him out of the frozen brush. Whoever hid this child didn't survive to unhide it. I'd thought, in those exact cold words, and I'd been right, and being right about a thing like that is no comfort at all. What I hadn't known, what the letter laid on my table like a card turned face up, was that someone had lived to know the child had been hidden and had never been found among the dead. Sonny, she had survived the Bonito. She had lost her daughter, this young man's mother, in it, and she had spent the 22 years since carrying two impossible things at once. The certainty that her grandson had been hidden alive and the not knowing of what became of him after. Because a hidden baby that isn't among the dead is a baby that someone took. And an old grieving Chiricahua woman with no power and no standing and half her people scattered to the reservations spent 2 decades, by longer than that young man had been alive, asking, listening, following the thin cold thread of a rumor from mouth to mouth across the whole territory. A missionary couple headed east who'd carried an Indian foundling. A rancher who'd handed them a baby and said he found it orphaned on the trail. A name, finally, worn down to almost nothing by the years and the retelling, but still, at the bottom of it, a name. Crane. She'd traced it to me. She knew a rancher named Crane had carried a Chiricahua infant out of the country the winter of the Bonito and given it away. And through the missionaries, through church records, through the long, patient thread following of a woman who would not die until she'd finished, she'd traced the child forward, too, all the way to a grown young man named Samuel Wells living an Eastern life with a hole in the middle of him. And 2 years ago she had begun to write him. Carefully. A stranger claiming a blood tie is a hard letter to open, and she knew it, and she'd gone slow, and she'd earned his trust across 2 years and a stack of letters, and at the last, dying, she never told him she was dying. He learned that from her body on my table and not from her hand. She had set out to bring him the whole truth in person, to meet him once, to put her arms around her daughter's son one time before the dark took her. She'd asked him to come to Crane's land, to me, because the rancher who'd carried him out was the one living witness to the beginning of him, the one soul left who could tell the young man what the first hour of his life had been. She'd sent them to meet at my gate, the child and the witness, so the young man could have both halves at once, the grandmother who'd found him and the man who'd saved him. Saved him. That's what the letter called me. Samuel read it aloud, and I heard it, and something in my chest went out like a stepped-on coal. She thought I'd saved him. She had spent 22 years hunting the truth across a whole territory, and she had gotten it, all of it but the one piece that mattered most, the one piece no record holds and no rumor carries, the piece that lives only in the black private center of my own skull. She knew a rancher named Crane took the baby from the fire. She did not know that same rancher had ridden up the creek with the men who set the fire. She thought I was a passing man of mercy who'd found a hidden orphan and couldn't leave it to the cold. Half of that is even true. I told you back at the start, the smallest, poorest true thing a man ever hid behind. And now her grandson was sitting at my table with tears standing in his eyes, reading his dead grandmother's words, and those words told him that the old rancher across from him, me, God help me, was the good man who'd carried him out of the worst night in the history of his blood. And I was the only person left alive who knew the whole of it. He set the letter down. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat on the table to still them and looked at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen yet. Through the shattering and the quiet and the reading, I hadn't seen this. Something opening, something reaching. "It was you," he said. "Samuel, it was you." He said it again, and this time it came out wet and rising, the words a man says when the ground he stood on his whole life suddenly turns out to have had a floor under it after all. "You're the one," she says a rancher named Crane found me, carried me out, kept me alive long enough to, "You're him. You're the man who—" He couldn't finish it. He put the back of his wrist against his mouth. "I've spent my whole life not knowing if the first thing that ever happened to me was somebody wanting me or somebody throwing me away. And it was you. You wanted me enough to carry me 100 miles inside your coat. A stranger. A baby that wasn't yours from people that—" He stopped. Because even he, even in that moment, even not knowing the half of it, brushed up against the edge of the thing. From people that. From people that what? Samuel. From people that whom? Say it. Ask it. Ask the old man across the table who those people were to him, and what he was doing in that country that winter, and how a young rancher came to be close enough to a burning Chiricahua camp to hear an infant cry under the wreckage. He didn't ask. He was too full of the gift to go looking for the rot underneath it. He looked at me with his dead grandmother's letter open between us and his whole ruined, grateful face turned up like a man who's found, at the very bottom of the worst day of his life, one solid thing to stand on, and the one solid thing was me, was a lie shaped like me, was the softest reading of the truth wearing my face. And I understood sitting there, that I was standing at a fork I'd been riding toward for 22 years without knowing the road bent this way at all. I could let him have it. That's the plain size of it. I could sit in that chair and be the man his grandmother's letter said I was. I could let a grieving young man believe the first hour of his life was mercy, pure and simple, a passing stranger's kindness, and send him back east with that to keep him warm the rest of his days. He'd never know. Sonny was dead. Every other mouth that could name me was 22 years in the ground. Diego knew there'd been a party of settler men, but didn't know I'd ridden with it. I'd never told him, never told anyone. That was the whole architecture of the lie, the thing I'd built my quiet life on top of. There was no ledger anywhere in the world that held this entry but the one on my own table, in my own hand, that no living soul but me had ever read. I could close the book on it clean, let the boy keep his miracle. Take the ugly truth down into the ground with me, where it couldn't hurt anybody but the man who'd earned it. That's mercy, isn't it? Some would call that mercy. Or I could tell him, all of it, that the man who carried him out of the fire was one of the men who came to set it, that the mercy he wanted to build the rest of his life on had a murder standing behind it, that I'd taken him out of that brush shelter not clean and not simple, but with the smoke of his mother's death still in my clothes, because I was part of the thing that made him an orphan before I was ever the thing that kept him alive. I looked at him. I looked at that open, reaching, grateful face, his grandmother's daughter's son, a boy I'd held before he had a name I'd let myself learn, and I felt the whole weight of my life stand up at the table with us. And I knew that whatever I said next was going to be the truest entry I ever made or the last great lie I'd ever tell, and there'd be no marking it settled either way. There was one more thing, too. I hadn't told him yet. I hadn't found the way. Sewn into the oilcloth of that satchel, I'd felt it at midnight, small and hard, and made myself put it down. There was something Sonny had carried 300 miles that the letter itself never named. I could see, now in the daylight, the little seam where she'd hidden it. She'd sewn something into the cloth with her own hands, and she'd died before she could cut it free and put it in his. And she'd died before she finished the letter, too. He turned the last page over, hunting for more, the way you do, and there wasn't more. It stopped mid-sentence, stopped clean in the middle of a thought, the ink trailing off where her hand had failed her, some cold camp on some cold night on the long road to my gate. She'd been writing it as she came. She'd been writing the most important part of it on the way to say it to his face, and the road had run out from under her before either the writing or the saying was done. "There is one more thing you must know," Samuel read at the very end, his voice barely holding. "One more thing about that night that I could never put in any letter for fear it would be read by other eyes, and it is this. It is the thing that I have carried longest, and it changes." And then nothing. The pen lifted. The road took her. The sentence hung in my front room with no floor under it, and both of us, the young man and the old one, the lie and the truth of it, stared at the place where the words stopped, at the one secret the letter had been built around and never reached. Whatever the last thing was, the thing she'd carried longest, the thing that changed something, she'd died with it still inside her. She was gone before he arrived, but her letter held a life-changing secret. We buried her on the third day, on a rise above my north line, where the ground was still soft enough to take a spade before the real cold came, and locked it for the winter. Diego brought his wife and 2 of her people down from the flat, and they'd come a long way in the dark to do it right, and I stood back and let them, because a thing done right is a thing done by the ones who know the right of it, and I was not that man. I've buried a lot of what I've lost in a plain and wordless way, dug the hole, said the little I had, filled it in, went back to work, because work is the only prayer I ever learned to say without choking on it. This was not that. This had words in a language I didn't own, and a rhythm to the words, and there was a moment where the old woman among them, Diego's wife's aunt, a woman older than any of us, older than the country felt some mornings, put her hand flat on the wrapped shape of Sonny and spoke to her low and long. And though I didn't understand a syllable of it, I understood all of it, the way you understand weather, the way Pilate understood grief before I did. Samuel stood at the head of the grave and didn't say anything at all. He'd asked the night before in a raw and halting way whether it was allowed, whether he had the right to stand there, a man raised Eastern and Christian and Wells, at the burying of a grandmother he'd known for 2 years only in ink and never once in the flesh. He'd asked me like I'd know, which I didn't, and then he'd asked Diego, who did. And Diego had looked at this lost young man a long moment and said something I've kept in the ledger of my head ever since, unwritten, because some entries you don't trust to paper. "You are what she came 300 miles to reach," Diego told him. "You are the far end of her whole life's walking. There is no closer place to stand than that. Stand there." So he stood there, and when the old aunt finished her words and the first spadeful of that soft, cold ground went down, Samuel made a sound, one sound low, the kind a man makes when a thing that's been held up finally comes down inside him. And Diego's wife stepped to his side without a word and stood her shoulder against his arm the way you'd brace a fence post that started to lean, and held him up with her silence, a stranger holding up a stranger. Which is the only kind of holding up most of us ever get, and more than some of us deserve. I stood at the foot of the grave. I want you to understand where I put myself because I chose it, not the head where the blood stands, not among the mourners where I had no place, the foot, the far end. And all the while the words went up over her in a language I'd once ridden 100 miles to help wipe out of this country. I stood at the foot of Sonny's grave, and I did my arithmetic. And the arithmetic came out the same way it had come out every hour since Samuel opened that letter at my table. She had gone to her grave believing I was a merciful man. And her grandson stood 4 feet from me believing the same. And every hour I let it stand was another hour I let a dead woman be wrong about the last thing she ever tried to fix. The night before the burying, I hadn't slept. You'll have gathered by now I don't sleep much through the important parts of this. I sat up with my ledger and the fire like I have through every reckoning of my life, and I did the thing I do, which is I tried to write it down so it would be real. And for the first time in 40 years of keeping that book, I could not make the pen move. Because there were 2 entries, and only one of them could be true by morning. The first one I wrote out in my head a dozen times, told the boy nothing, let him keep it, carried the truth down alone. And every time I built that entry, I built the argument that goes under it, and it's a good argument, I want you to know it's not a coward's flimsy thing, it's a good argument, which is what makes it dangerous. The argument is, what does the truth serve? Sonny's dead. Her daughter's dead. Telling Samuel that the man who carried him out was one of the men who came to kill doesn't bring a single soul back. It doesn't undo 1 minute of that winter. All it does is reach into the one warm thing the boy's got, the belief that his life began in mercy, and pour poison in it. That's not confession, the argument says. That's just an old man buying his own peace with a young man's. That's just me wanting to set my book straight at his cost. And a debt you pay off with somebody else's money isn't paid at all. It's a good argument. I sat in the firelight and I nearly took it. Then near midnight I got the satchel down again and I took my knife, and I did the thing I'd stopped myself from doing the first night. I cut the little seam. Sonny had sewn it tight and small, the way you sew a thing you mean to keep against everything, against rain, against thieves, against your own death on a cold road. It took me a while. My hands aren't what they were, and I was going slow on purpose because part of me was afraid, and a man my age has learned to respect the things that frighten him without a reason he can name. What fell out into my palm was a stone. A blue stone, flat, no bigger than a thumbnail, worn smooth as river glass on one face and rough on the other, with a hole bored through one end where a thong had once been strung. Turquoise. The kind a person wears against the skin for so many years it stops being an ornament and becomes a part of the body, like a scar you chose. And I knew it. I want to be careful here, because memory is a liar and I've caught it lying to me before, dressing up things I wished I'd seen as things I did. But I don't think it lied to me that night. I think I knew that stone. Because when I dug an infant out of a burning brush shelter 22 years gone, there'd been a thing tied at the baby's throat on a thong, a small blue stone, and I'd meant to keep it with him, meant it to go east with him so the child would have one thing of his own, and in the chaos and the cold and the handing off I'd lost track of it. That's the truth. I never knew what became of it. I'd assumed I dropped it on the trail, or the missionaries pocketed it, or it was gone the way small things go. I'd carried a low private shame about it for 2 decades, that I couldn't even manage to keep one small stone attached to the one life I'd carried out. And I'd never told a soul, because how do you confess losing a thing you were never supposed to be near in the first place? Sonny had it. I sat with it in my palm, and I understood, slow, the way the cold understands you before you understand it. She hadn't just traced the rumor of a crane and a baby. Somewhere in 22 years of walking this country and asking and listening, she had found this, her daughter's stone, the stone that had hung at her grandson's throat the night the world burned. And she'd gotten it back into her own hands, and she'd carried it 300 more miles to sew it into a satchel and put it, at last, back around the neck of the boy it belonged to. She'd meant to give it to him herself. She'd meant to lift it over his head with her own living hands and tell him, this was your mother's. She died with this touching you. You have never once in your life been a person without people. And she died 4 fields short of doing it. I closed my hand on that stone and I put my face down on my own table in the firelight, an old man alone, and I did the second thing I hadn't done since the winter of the Bonito. I won't tell you I did it well or long. I'm out of practice. But I did it, and the ledger stayed open and empty in front of me the whole time, and when I lifted my head I still didn't know which entry I was going to write, but I knew this much. The stone wasn't mine to keep, or mine to decide about, or mine to spare him. Nothing in that satchel was. Sonny hadn't crossed 300 miles to hand her grandson a comfortable truth. She'd crossed it to hand him all of it, the whole weight, the way you hand a grown man his inheritance and trust him to carry what's his. The letter that broke off, there is one more thing you must know, the thing I have carried longest, and it changes. She'd been about to give him the heavy part. The dangerous part. The part for fear it would be read by other eyes. She, of all people, had decided the boy should have the full account. Who was I, the last man standing at the foot of her grave, to overrule the dead on the one thing they died trying to say? I gave him the stone the morning after the burial. We were out by the corral. He was saddling up to start the long ride back east. There was nothing to keep him, he said, and a man has to be somewhere, and east was where his life, such as it was, still sat waiting. And I came out with the stone in my closed hand, and I stopped him with a hand on the horse's neck. Before you go, I said, there's a thing of yours I've been holding. I opened my hand. I watched him look at it and not know it, and then, slower the way I had start to know it, some old animal memory with no picture attached to it stirring behind his eyes. What is it? he said, but quiet, already halfway to understanding it, was a what is it that would answer itself. It was tied at your throat, I said. The night I carried you out, it was your mother's before it was yours. Sonny got it back somehow, God knows how, God knows what it cost her, and she sewed it into that satchel to give to you herself. She'd have put it around your neck with her own hands if the road had let her. I held it out. It didn't, so I'm doing it poorly in her place. Here, it's yours. It was always yours. You've owned one thing your whole life, Samuel, and you never even knew you had it, because I lost hold of it 22 years ago and she spent 22 years finding it again. He took it in both hands the way you take something living. And then he did the thing I will carry to my own grave, the thing that made the fork in the road disappear behind me and left only the one way through. He didn't put it on. He held it, and he looked up at me over it, and his face was so open, so undefended, so full of a gratitude I had not earned and could not survive, and he said, "You've given me everything, Mr. Crane. You saved my life, and now you've given me the only thing left of my mother, and I don't have any way to pay you back a thing like that. I don't have anything that even." "Stop," I said. It came out harder than I meant. It stopped him. I stood there in the cold morning with my hand still open where the stone had been, and I looked at that boy, Sonny's daughter's son, the far end of a whole life's walking, and I understood that the good argument, the dangerous good argument I'd nearly taken by the fire, had led me exactly wrong. Because a lie you let a man build his gratitude on isn't mercy. It's just a slower cruelty. Every year Samuel spent being grateful to me for a mercy that had a murder standing behind it would be a year I'd stolen from the truth of his own mother, who did not need her son's gratitude going to one of the men who killed her. She needed it kept for her. And I could not, standing in the light with her stone still warm from my own hand, let it come to me under false colors. Not one more minute. "Before you thank me again," I said, "you're going to hear the rest of it, all of it, and then you can decide what you owe me, if anything, and I'll take whatever verdict you hand down, and I'll deserve it, whatever it is." My voice was going, but I kept it moving. "Sit down on that rail. This is the part your grandmother couldn't finish. I think it's the part she was writing here to tell you to my face so I'd have to stand in the room while you heard it. And she was right to want that. So sit down. And let me tell you who was really riding up the Bonito that winter, and what I was doing there, and how a young rancher came to be close enough to a burning camp to hear a baby cry." He went very still. I watched the first shadow of it reach him, watched him understand that the story had a floor under its floor, and that the old man he'd been thanking had been standing on a trapdoor the whole time. His hand closed around the blue stone. "Mr. Crane," he said, and his voice had gone careful again, careful the way it had been that first gray dawn in my yard, the careful of a man walking into cold water on purpose. "What are you telling me?" And I told him, "I'm not going to write it out again. You've had it back in the first part, the whole ugly shape of it, the strayed horses I called stolen, the party of angry men, the young hot righteousness, the frozen creek, the families that weren't a war camp, the freezing at the edge of it, the not firing that saved nothing and forgave nothing. I told him all of it, and I told it plain, and I didn't reach once for the small, poor, true thing to hide behind. I didn't say I found you orphaned. I said I helped orphan you, and then I could not live with what I'd helped do. So I took the one life I could still reach out of the fire, and I have been paying on that account, badly, alone, for 22 years. And I am telling you now because your grandmother's dead hand pointed me at the truth, and I found I was too old and too tired to keep lying at a graveside." He didn't say anything for a long time. The horse shifted. Pilot came and sat down between us like he wasn't sure anymore whose side of this to be on, which made two of us. The sun climbed. Somewhere down on the flat one of Diego's colts was calling for another and getting no answer. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice had nothing in it I could read. That was the worst of it. After 2 days of a face I could read like whether he'd gone closed. "You carried me 100 miles, he said, "inside your coat." Yes, after. So the first thing that ever happened to me, the very first thing," he stopped, started over. His hand was white around the stone. "It wasn't mercy and it wasn't cruelty, it was both. It was the same hands." "Yes," I said, "the same hands. That's the truth of you, son, and I'm sorry past any saying that it is, and I'd have given a great deal to be able to hand you a cleaner one. But you didn't come 300 miles to my gate for a clean lie. Neither did she." He stood up off the rail. I braced for it. I told myself I'd take whatever verdict he handed down, and I meant it. If he'd struck me, I'd have let him. If he'd cursed me and ridden off, and let the door of my life slam shut on 22 years of unpaid account, I'd have marked it settled at last and been, in some cold corner of me, almost glad. A debt collected is a debt closed, even when the coin is your own ruin. He didn't strike me, he didn't curse me. He looked at the stone in his hand a long, long moment. His mother's stone, his own stone, the one thing he'd owned his whole life without knowing. Then he lifted the thong over his own head and settled it at his throat, where it had hung the night everything began, and he tucked it down under his shirt against his skin, and he stood there with his hand pressed flat over it, over his own heart, holding it there like you'd hold a wound or a warmth. I couldn't tell which, and I don't think he could either. She knew, he said. Son, my grandmother, the letter, the thing I have carried longest, the thing she couldn't put down for fear of other eyes. He looked at me, and his own eyes were wet and steady both at once. She knew what you were, not just the good stranger. She knew you rode with them. She traced you close enough to find this. His hand pressed the stone. She traced you close enough to find me. You think she didn't trace you close enough to find that? The ground went out from under me a second time in 3 days. She knew, he said again, and something was breaking open in his face that wasn't only grief now, and she was still riding here to put us in a room together. She wasn't bringing me to a hero, Mr. Crane. She was bringing me to you, the whole of you, both hands. He drew a breath that shook the length of him. That's the thing that changes everything. That's the sentence that broke off, not he saved you. It was. And there Samuel stopped, the same way her letter had stopped, on the lip of the thing itself, because he didn't know how she'd have finished it any more than I did, because the road had taken the end of that sentence, and there was no getting it back, not from her, not ever, and both of us stood in the cold with the shape of it hanging unfinished between us exactly where she'd left it. Whatever she'd meant to tell him, that a man can be the wound and the mending both, that the ones who broke you are sometimes the only ones left to carry you out, that she'd found it in herself across 22 years to want her grandson to stand in a room with all of it and choose for himself what to do with a truth that big. Whatever the end of that sentence was, she'd carried it as far as a body can carry a thing, and then a little further. And she'd fallen 4 fields short of my gate with it still on her tongue. Samuel got on his horse. I thought that was the verdict. I thought he'd ride, and I'd have my closed book and my empty house and pilot and the grave up on the rise, and it would be no more than the exact and honest price of the thing. He turned the horse. Then he stopped it. He didn't look back at me. He looked north, up toward the rise, toward the soft new mound where his grandmother lay under words in a language he'd have to spend the rest of his life learning if he wanted them. And he sat like that a while, his hand still pressed to the stone under his shirt. I don't know what I owe you, he said to the north, not to me. I don't think there's a word for what I owe you or you owe me or we owe her. I don't think it goes in any book. Now he looked down at me, and the boy's careful Eastern voice had something new under it, something that had come 300 miles to get made. But I know I'm not riding east today. I'm going to stay till spring. I'm going to learn what those words meant that they said over her. And you're going to teach me every single thing you can remember about that night, all of it, however many times it takes. Because it's mine, Mr. Crane. It's the only inheritance I've got, and you've been holding it for 22 years, and I've come to collect. I opened my mouth. Nothing came. That's the payment, he said. You want to settle your account with me. That's how, not by me forgiving you. I don't know if I can, and I'm not going to lie to a man who just stopped lying to me. You settle it by remembering out loud every day till there's nothing left in you I don't know. You carried me once. Now you carry me the rest of the way into who I am. That's the debt. Take it or don't. I have kept a book my whole life. I have written down every kindness owed and every cruelty owed, and I have needed it written before I could sleep, needed a thing accounted for before I could set it down. And there has been one line in that book for 22 years that I could never close. That night after he'd stabled his horse in my barn like a man who was staying, after the lamp was low and Pilot was asleep against the door and a strange young man was breathing in the back room where his grandmother had lain 3 days before, that night I took the book down and I found the line. One life, taken out of the fire, given away, owed to whom, unknown, cannot be paid. I didn't mark it settled. I sat with the pen a long time and I understood, finally, that I'd had it wrong my whole life, that some accounts aren't meant to be closed, that a thing marked settled is a thing you've decided to stop carrying, and this was not a thing I got to stop carrying ever, and that the not stopping was itself the only honest payment I would ever make. So I didn't write settled. I didn't write anything under it at all. I just turned the page and started a clean one, and at the top of it I wrote his name. His first name, the real one, the one I won't put here. And under it I wrote the date, and then I sat there in the low light with the pen resting on the empty page below, waiting, the way you wait at a gate, for whatever's coming up the road to arrive.